So what do you do with Jesus in a New Thought church? In a church that looks at Jesus differently than mainline Christianity, and certainly very differently than fundamentalist Christianity looks at Jesus. What do we do with him? I think it was you, Jimmer, who first told me of the quote, and I don't remember who to attribute the quote to, but the quote that says, I really love the guy. I love Jesus, but I'm not so fond of some in his fan club. Can you relate to that? I do love him, and I do consider him my teacher and my spiritual way shower. I look at him as a teacher of consciousness, as someone that stood for a different way of living and being. Certainly someone who stood in his day and age for a different form of social justice, repeatedly contrasting what he thought was the way to live life and the way to interact with one another from the way the old Mosaic law would teach social justice. He stood as someone who believed in the goodness within individuals. He stood as someone who understood his relationship with God, his relationship with the Father, and encouraged others to find that same kind of relationship. We say in Unity that Jesus was not the great exception, but what? The great example. The great example. But Easter, what do you do with it? So there was a family who was vacationing in Jerusalem, and the family was an extended family. It was the mother and the father and some kids and the mother-in-law, and they were having a wonderful time visiting all the sites of the Holy City, spending time in Jerusalem, but tragedy struck. The mother-in-law died while in Jerusalem. And so they needed to make preparations to have her body sent back home. And so the husband went to the American consulate to begin that process. And they said to him, well, yes, we can mail her body, not mail her body, but send her body. Too much UPS in my life. Can send her body back home, but it's actually a very complicated and very, very expensive process. To do that, it can cost upwards of $10,000. So what most people do if something like this happens in Jerusalem is they will bury the body here, and it's much less expensive. It only costs a few $100s to do that. And so the man thought for a moment, and then he said, no, I absolutely positively want to send her body back to the U.S. And the consulate said, well, wow, you must have really, really loved your mother-in-law. He said, well, no, it's not so much that, but I heard of a guy who was buried here a very long time ago, and 3 days later he rose from the dead, and I'm not taking any chances. I'm not taking any chances. Poor mother-in-laws, and if you are a mother-in-law, please forgive the joke. It just wouldn't work with father-in-law, would it? It just wouldn't have the same punch. So regardless, why do I tell that joke, besides the fact that it's incredibly funny? Because regardless of how you look upon the resurrection, whether you look upon the resurrection as something that literally happened, or whether you look upon the resurrection as something mystical and metaphysical, what we cannot deny is something happened. Something happened in the mind and the heart, the consciousness, the soul of this man called Jesus so radically that we still talk about him today, that there's even a story about him, that we even need to try to understand something about him. So something absolutely happened. And I believe that we can learn from his teachings and his message how to live our lives much better. That to me is the good news. The good news is that he gives us a blueprint for that. And I want to share some of that blueprint this morning with the idea that these teachings help us to be able to face and meet the changes in our lives.